under a sky the color of pearl, in the hush before dawn of the year 1623, a scream ripped through the marble stillness of Topkapı Palace like a blade drawn across glass. It was not the cry of a soldier's wound, nor the desperate shout of a captured enemy. It was the voice of a girl barely 15, Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of a ruler the world called unmatched, a voice so sharp and cold that even the eunuchs at the door stepped back and let terror finish what no command dared to interrupt. What happened that night was not a household misfortune. It was the unveiling of a price demanded of every daughter of the dynasty, a toll carved first into spirit, then into flesh, and carefully silenced by official histories for 6 long centuries. Those cries did not rise from a bleeding cut. They rose from a secret ritual designed to bend a will before it touched a body, condemning royal girls to life in the shadows before they had even reached womanhood. For more than 6 centuries, the Ottoman world maintained a marriage protocol so severe that even the bitterest foe would hesitate to wish it upon a child of his own. It was a system scrubbed from the record, hidden behind tapestries and gold latticework, rediscovered only centuries later when forgotten papers were drawn from the dust of a locked Istanbul archive in the year 2019. Across the earth, from farm huts to glittering courts, people dreamed of a princess's life, of silk and jewels and servants. Yet beyond those shining walls there waited a nightmare so precise, so elegantly cruel, that many who lived it wished for the quiet of the grave over the lot assigned to a bride. Come, witness a truth long sealed. This is not a fairy tale. It is a chronicle of dread, dressed up as imperial ceremony, layered with incense and protocol to keep its core hidden. And before the doors open any further, a small request. If this story has already stirred something, mark the moment, lend support, share the tale, and name a queen or princess whose veiled fate should be unveiled next. Whether Marie Antoinette, Cleopatra, or Anne Boleyn, the next secret waits for a voice to choose it. Now walk the colonnades with this story and see why so many daughters of a golden palace chose the stillness of the tomb over the marriage bed prepared for them. The Ottoman Empire stretched like a sea without shores, casting a shadow across 3 continents for more than 600 years. From the year 1299 to the year 1922, its power rolled from the gates of Vienna to the burned sands of Yemen. The fall of Constantinople in the year 1453 turned a legendary city into the beating heart of an imperial machine, renamed Istanbul, with Topkapı Palace raised as its brightest jewel. There, within gilded walls and perfumed courtyards, the destinies of provinces and souls were decided. Behind screens and innumerable corridors, the imperial harem became a world unto itself, a closed universe that, at its height, housed more than 800 women. Every breath was watched. Every gesture might lift a life or ruin it. From the year 1530 onward, when Suleiman the Magnificent granted his wife, Harem, the title of Haseki Sultan, the harem ceased to be merely a place of pleasure. It became a theater of alliances and hushed conflict, where women learned to read the currents of power without moving their lips. Most concubines were Christian captives, taken far from home or bought in the markets of North Africa, brought to the palace with a single hope, to catch the eye of the sovereign and trade bondage for influence. Their days filled with music, embroidery, poetry, and rehearsed obedience. Paradoxically, these women, torn from their families, sometimes found more space to maneuver than the daughters born at the pinnacle of rank. The so-called Sultanate of women between the mid-16th and mid-17th centuries showed just how far a determined mind could reach behind a curtain. Figures like Kosem Sultan and Turhan Hatice. Sultan steered councils, weighed wars, and wrote lines into Ottoman history with patience sharpened into power. Yet, while they climbed, the royal daughters entered a darker maze. They were pawns on a board of diplomacy, human seals pressed onto treaties, instruments to choke off rebellion or buy the loyalty of a pasha with ambitions of his own. Into this machinery, Princess Fatma Sultan was born in the year 1606, child of Sultan Ahmed and the formidable Kosem, a woman so capable of ruling from the shadows that some whispered she wore a crown no one could see. Fatma grew among gardens heavy with scent and teachers who charted the heavens. She read Arabic and Persian manuscripts. She listened as scholars praised her sharpness and court chroniclers marveled at her poise. Yet neither knowledge nor talent nor a mother's reach could block a path inked before the cradle cooled. She would be married as collateral, proof against disloyalty, a hinge between power and compliance. The groom was chosen, Kara Mustafa Pasha, a seasoned commander 2 full decades older, tempered by campaigns against Persia, a man whose loyalty had been hammered in the fires of siege and winter marches. There would be no romance, no choice, not even the pity of a gentler hand, only the cold clarity of imperial logic. For him, the union was a staircase to higher rank. For her, it was the first step into tragedy. From her earliest years, Fatma was a child apart. She spoke 4 languages with unforced ease. She practiced Arabic and Persian calligraphy with a poet's calm and chased the secrets of the stars with the hunger of a born learner. Palace tutors called her a wonder, a girl who could hold her own with gray-bearded men in history, law, and geography. None of it mattered. Her life did not belong to her. Invisible parchment carried her future to those who needed to read it, and when they were done, the ink dried on a name. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the war-proven veteran, 20 years her senior. The match was not forged in fire and feeling. It was calculated, exact, bloodless. He reached for advancement. She, still hardly more than a child, became a sacrifice laid on an imperial chessboard. 3 months before the wedding, the palace opened a door to a chamber known as Sacred Instruction. The name sounded holy. The practice was not. Reserved for princesses and mirrored in no other court, it was the polished product of long experimentation in psychological control, designed to teach obedience to those born never to bow. The woman appointed to supervise it was Gulnar Hatun, 60 years old, head of the Harem, witness to the conditioning of more than a dozen royal brides. Under her severity, Fatma entered the bride's room, a chamber lacquered with ebony and rolled in Persian rugs, where every surface rehearsed the words duty and destiny. From early light until midday, the girl learned to perform humility as if it were a dance with fixed steps. 18 distinct forms of bowing had to be mastered: greetings, offerings, kneeling for service, postures of silent readiness for a husband's arrival. Even the act of walking became a lesson. There were measured paces with the head kept at a 30-degree angle, hands trained not to rise above the heart. Each movement shaved away a sliver of royal dignity, reshaping a princess into someone compliant, contained, and quiet. Speech cut deeper. Her vocabulary was pared down to 43 permitted words. Phrases of thanks, phrases of acceptance, small requests presented low, apologies softened until they hardly seemed to belong to a human at all. A deviation, even a flicker of thought escaping the net, brought punishment. Forced fasting, hours in a stone cell called a chamber of reflection, or staged humiliation before the women of the household. She was judged by a tribunal of ladies and eunuchs, presided over by her own mother, who weighed her submission as if it were coin at a market. But the most unsettling trial was the rehearsal for the first night. In underground rooms, carpenters and artisans arranged exact copies of bridal chambers. Wax figures, anatomical and expressionless, stood where a man would stand. Instructors watched with faces like closed doors. Under their eyes, Fatma was compelled to practice gestures and acts no girl of her age should be made to know. Every response, Fear, tears, resistance went into coded ledgers. Signs of refusal meant another session, then another. More pain, more conditioning, until the bright child who had loved the sky's map of stars was coaxed into a quiet creature taught to forget her own shape. The breaking did not end with posture, pacing, or silence. A program of mental cleansing followed. Fatma memorized verse after verse drawn from Ottoman and Persian treatises on wifely obedience, reciting aloud before concubines and eunuchs who sat in judgment. Passages from council books praising submission and sacrifice were pressed into her mouth until the songs she once loved, poems of love and astronomy, faded from memory. Prayer, too, was chained to control. 5 times each day, at fixed moments, she recited special supplications crafted by court scholars, not for free devotion, but to erase the last lines of a self and exalt a total giving of body and will. Postures of worship were braided with gestures of a bride's duty, turning the sacred into an instrument. Humiliation reached further. Twice a week before the gathered women of the court, the princess served her father's favored concubines with her own hands. She washed them, combed their hair, fed them, dressed them for intimate summons. The ceremony had one intention: to snap the final thread of pride by forcing a royal daughter to render service to those who shared the sovereign's bed. Witnesses later wrote that Fatma sobbed uncontrollably more than once as she adjusted another woman's robes, the cloth prepared for walking through a door where she could never stand. A week before the wedding, the rules tightened again. The princess was moved to the bride's pavilion, a small palace unto itself, sealed and soundless. There, everything was measured: the food she ate, the way she bathed, the oils rubbed into her skin. Pomegranates, honey, almonds, goat's milk, spices from Yemen. Baths supervised by specialists in purification with perfumes steeped in valerian, poppy, and bitter orange flower. The elixirs were prepared by alchemists trained in distant schools, and some contained quiet agents that eased the body into compliance and gently lifted the will off its hinges. Silk tapestries on the walls told the stories the court wanted told. Ideal wives from revered traditions, obedient, fruitful, yielding, promised rewards of paradise. Venetian mirrors, placed like sentries, forced Fatma to watch herself as she practiced, a constant surveillance by her own eyes. A contemplative discipline, once meant to elevate the soul, was repurposed as a mirror maze to trap every stray thought. In this isolation, the truth settled. She was no longer sovereign of her life. Her voice, her movements, her mind, each was being rewritten into a script of obedience. The training had done its work. It had not merely gentled a princess. It had erased a curious, intelligent girl who loved the firmament and left in her place a figure shaped to fit a ceremony. The wedding day came on the 15th of March in the year 1623. From first light, Istanbul pulsed like a heart too full. Processions filled the streets, music and incense rolled through courtyards, and in Topkapi's halls, gold dishes flashed with banquet brilliance. Dancers brought from Persia and Andalusia spun until silk blurred. The Empire's finest singers braided melody over drums and lute. Janissaries showed their skill with displays that drew cheers even from men who rarely smiled. It glittered like a festival of allegiance. For the girl at its center, it was the preface to a sentence. Chroniclers note that while laughter and wine circled the rooms, Fatma stood apart. Quiet, lips dry, eyes fixed on nothing. Palace physicians tracked every breath and glance. They recorded signs that today would be called panic attacks. Tremors, cold sweat that ignored the cool March air, a vanished appetite, spells of broken breathing that made witnesses fear the worst. Public splendor rose to its highest pitch, and inside, one-heart terror pooled and grew. When the last cup was raised and the civilian guests withdrew, a quieter procession began, the most fearsome of all. Fatma was led to the bridal pavilion in the private gardens, a design that reached back to the days of Mehmed the Conqueror. It was an octagon in 3 levels, each with a purpose: cleansing, surrender, consummation. The architecture preached without speaking. Every corner narrowed choice. Every stair translated ceremony into submission. The first level was for purification. Hours of ritual bathing followed, on marble quarried from the white mountains of Carrara, with waters perfumed by rose of Damascus, jasmine, sandalwood, and amber shipped up from Somali shores. Lotions laced with diluted opium and mandrake soothed and dulled, coaxing calm from muscles, while the mind, somewhere deep, tried to shout. Court doctors later named the result a trance of obedience, the body surrender while the soul strained to resist. The second level was for surrender. There, Fatma was dressed in a wedding robe of white silk threaded with gold and dotted with pearls from the Gulf. It looked like majesty and wore like a trap. Hidden fastenings and inner cords made stillness easy to enforce. A crown heavy enough to curb movement. Anklets and bracelets that bit gently at freedom. Shoes with thick soles that stole the chance to run. The gown was a prison sewn out of luxury. While the princess was wrapped into a symbol of obedience, Kara Mustafa Pasha stood in other rooms for other lessons. Advisors and war veterans taught him the words that pressed dignity down and the gestures that broke a will without leaving a mark. Methods of intimidation, calibrated phrases of humiliation, techniques of dominance learned in siege tents and drilled into memory. There would be no space left for doubt, no pause that might let defiance breathe. Then came the third level, the chamber of consummation. Tapestries on the walls showed mounted men in smoking cities, captured princesses, armies ground beneath a sovereign's boots. None of it was accidental. This was victory translated into a bed, war remapped onto a room, furniture designed by craftsmen who knew how to hold a body in place, beds threaded with hidden lines, cushions soaked with soothing, oils. Light turned low enough to blur edges and close exits. It was a stage for the breaking of a promise never spoken, that a life could be a life and not a function. When the door closed and the attendants faded, time narrowed to a breath. Records written in guarded script by unseen observers would later call what followed a total collapse of spirit. The girl who had endured months of drills and shaming could no longer assemble a coherent response. Her body shook without rhythm. Her voice shrank to a thread no one could follow. Her eyes wandered as if looking at a landscape no one else could see. Imperial physicians would give it a name later, shock complete, words too neat for what a human face can hold. Kara Mustafa Pasha had spent years learning to impose his will on fortresses and men. He met this silence first with the tools he had been taught. The words meant to shrink, the stillness meant to intimidate, the careful touch that declared without asking. What he found was not rebellion but absence, not defiance, but a mind gone elsewhere to survive. When consummation finally happened, hours later, after attempts that failed and failed again, secret notes in Persian script recorded both the body's injuries and a rhythm of fainting that returned like a tide. One line spoke of the soul's departure, a phrase the doctors used when language could not carry what the room had held. After that night, nothing returned to what it had been. In the days that followed, even the strict women of the harem changed their faces when she passed. A selective muteness took root. She spoke only in a whisper, and only when a direct question cornered her. Food lost all meaning. Nurses forced nourishment between lips that would not open. She cried without warning, sometimes for hours, and a new fear appeared. The mere presence of a man, even a trusted eunuch, sent her into spirals of panic, racing breath, torrents of sweat, abrupt collapse. Court medicine gave the condition a tidy label, virginal melancholy, an illness they claimed to see often after a royal first night. In other terms, it was a wound that no herb could seal, a trauma braided so tightly into mind and memory that prayer and music could not loosen it. They tried what they had: infusions, songs, the contemplative practices of Sufi discipline. Nothing brought back the girl who argued with scholars and recited verses about the stars. Her instruments gathered dust, her books stayed shut. Gardens she had once crossed with quick steps went untended, their paths fading back into the grass. The daughter of an all-powerful sovereign became a presence without a pulse, a figure moving through ceremonies like a shadow of what might have been. The marriage hardened into routine. Children came. Appearances were kept. In private, silence expanded to fill the halls. Later accounts claim the Pasha fled into campaigns and opium in equal measure, trying to dull the knowledge that he had been forged into, an instrument of a ritual that ruined the woman he married. Princess Fatma lived on for 29 years after that night, a companion to processions, a mother by requirement, a wife without a voice. Her death in the year 1652, given the official cause of a fever of the brain, fell on the anniversary of her wedding. At court, few called it coincidence. Some said the weight of memory finally closed its hand. Fatma's fate was not an accident, but a pattern, repeated as calmly as any other protocol. Palace records dragged out centuries later, smelling of leather and neglect, revealed dozens of royal daughters who found themselves on the same path. Some fell into lifelong silence. Some hurled themselves at escape, the leap, the blade, the madness that offered a door where the palace built only walls. A few vanished from entries as if they had never been born at all. The imperial machine was precise in what it showed and what it erased, wrapping absence in courteous phrases and polishing the record until it reflected only what power wanted to see. There are documents, newly translated, that speak of princesses who staged their own deaths to avoid a second marriage, of others who built secret codes to speak to sisters forced into quiet, and of a few whose courage reached the throne itself with a plea for divorce, a hand raised against a system that called itself unbreakable. These buried pages prove what should always have been believed. Even in rooms without light, resistance learns to breathe. The tragedy of Fatma and those who shared her lot exposes a truth many prefer not to touch. Absolute power does not always shield the ones who hold it. Sometimes it makes them the first victims of the monument they are forced to uphold. The world imagined Ottoman princesses draped in luxury and command. The reality was an invisible chain, engineered with the care of a clockwork, meant to sacrifice lives to preserve alliances and shape. Look back and understand. The Imperial Harem was not merely a stage for intrigue and silk. It was also a theater of enforced silence and discarded tears. The tales sold as glittering romances were political constructions that ate the sovereign's daughters first. And so a question waits where the story pauses. How many secrets still sleep in old palaces, inked in a hand no one reads, waiting for the key that never turns? What hidden rites did other courts, European, Russian, Chinese, dress up as ceremony? What price did the women chosen to sustain dynasties truly pay? If Fatma's story has moved the heart, then stay. Share it with those who deserve to hear what lies behind the lace and gold. Name the queen or princess whose path should be brought into the light next. Perhaps a Russian Tsarina feared by her own mother. Perhaps a Chinese empress bound to rituals too dark to speak plainly. Perhaps a daughter of Europe pledged as collateral for a treaty. Only by learning these hidden truths can Awat Bichamaparbabai mask be lifted and the muffled voices of those sacrificed to power be heard at last. The seasons turned, and the palace learned to move around a quiet figure who moved through it like moonlight, present, pale, untouchable. Years after the wedding, the rhythm of court life folded Fatma into its processions and ceremonies, but never again into its joys. There were births that the chroniclers celebrated in ornate lines, and there were formal visits where she stood at a measured angle, her gaze lowered, her voice a hush that never rose above a prayer. Those who remembered her as a girl with quick thoughts and bright questions learned to speak of her in the past tense, even while she was in the room. A sovereign's daughter had been repurposed into a symbol, a marriage made, a treaty held, a dynasty secured. Kara Mustafa Pasha returned often to campaigns, and the distance became its own custom. When he was in the city, silence stood between them like an attendant who never left. In public, he was a pillar carved for display. In private, he carried an exhaustion he could not confess. Men hardened by long wars sometimes discover that victory leaves them emptier than defeat. For him, the greater the triumph, the more insistent the hollowness. Some nights he drifted on smoke, dense enough to dull memory. Others he walked the gardens until dawn, circling the same paths that once taught Fatma the constellations she no longer named. At court, Kosem Sultan ruled in the spaces that did not officially exist, threading influence through councils, stipends, and the careful appointment of eyes and ears. She protected what she could: the grandchildren, the allowances, the rooms where her daughter might be left in peace. Yet even Kosem, whose will had bent viziers to her plans, could not unmake a ritual that had been crafted across generations. She learned to guard the remnants, moments of calm, days without panic, hours when a harp's vibration stirred something like recollection and did not immediately vanish. Beyond Topkapi's walls, the empire's story pressed forward like a caravan that will not stop for the fallen. Provinces were tested by famine and tax. Governors were replaced, then replaced again. Janissaries argued stipends in voices that carried down the avenues, and scribes dipped their pens to give the noise a neat shape. In the suburbs, craftsmen hammered a future out of iron and patience. In the port, sailors' shouts rose with the masts. All of it flowed around the palace as the Bosphorus flowed around its promontory, tireless, indifferent, gleaming. Inside, the women's world followed its own seasons. Children were taught their letters with sugar on slate. Girls practiced the arts that made rooms beautiful. Embroidery that could stitch a bird into flight. Music that could coax tears from stone. Stories traveled faster than footsteps. Who had risen, who had fallen, whose gift had landed with the right person at the right time. Fatma listened when her strength allowed, her hands warm around a cup scented with orange blossom, her mind drifting to star maps she had once held, in thought the way a sailor holds a coast in his bones. Some afternoons she walked the galleries with an older attendant who had known her since childhood. They named the trees in the gardens like old friends, the cypress that leaned as if listening, the plane tree whose bark peeled in scrolls. It was not recovery. It was endurance, dressed in small rituals that a day could bear. The old practices did not disappear. They adapted. Sacred instruction continued for other royal daughters, polished to suit a new decade and a new overseer. Manuals were updated with the language of virtue and tradition. Words like duty and purity wore a priest's voice and a jurist's seal. Behind the phrases, the machine kept its time. In private, a handful of women, an elder tutor, a midwife whose hands had calmed 100 panics, a literate concubine with a memory for verse, began to weave a slender counter-pattern. They taught one another signals hidden in ordinary gestures, the tilt of a cup for fear, the way a shawl was knotted for danger, the choice of a specific scent to ask for help without saying so. It did not undo anything. It made enduring less solitary. There were rare, lucid mornings when the air felt new and the mind's windows opened. On such a morning, Fatma asked for paper. The calligrapher's reed pen fit her fingers as if it had been waiting all those years for this return. She wrote slowly at first, letters formed like careful breaths. Not poems, not petitions. Lines that named what had been taken without hating the takers, and what had survived without pretending to be whole. She did not show the pages to anyone. She folded them into a small packet and tucked them into the lining of a chest that held shawls from Damascus and a child's first shoes. Later, when the lucid hours receded, she would rest a hand on the chest as if feeling for a pulse. News of the world arrived in fragments. A fortress changing hands, a rebellion tamped down, a treaty extended with a new clause that everyone pretended not to notice. One winter, a sickness walked the city and left too many doors marked by absence. The palace physicians burned herbs and carried their knowledge like a lantern moving from room to room. Fatma fell ill and rose again, lighter by something she could not name. The body keeps ledgers, and sometimes it balances them without consulting the mind. The children grew. A son whose laughter came easily learned to mask it in council chambers and let it spill only in the garden with his mother. A daughter learned to read both texts and faces, and she asked questions that did not announce themselves as questions. Fatma loved them without ceremony. She taught them the language of the sky, how the moon owned nothing and lit everything, how a season's turn could be felt in the breath long before it arrived in the trees. She did not speak to them about fear. She taught them how to be still without being erased, how to breathe in a room that wanted to claim every breath. Kara Mustafa Pasha returned from a distant campaign with a scar that remained hidden beneath his sleeve and a softness around the eyes that had not been there before. He stood in the doorway of the room where Fatma sat with a book closed on her lap and did not step forward. In another life, they might have shared the same story. In this one, the story had assigned them different tasks. He bowed, a soldier's bow pared down to its core, and left without a word. That night, the gardens smelled of wet earth, and the lamps along the paths burned lower than usual, as if the air itself had asked for gentleness. Whispers of other princesses reached the harem like weather reports from far coasts. One was said to have feigned an illness severe enough to halt a second marriage until an ally could be found. Another passed notes stitched into the hems of garments that traveled between palaces, a code that mapped safety and danger with the names of flowers. One, astonishingly, was granted a dissolution of marriage after months of petitions and the steady application of a grandmother's influence. The women did not celebrate aloud. They stored the tales like provisions against a winter that always came. Years fold a person into the shape of the hours they can bear. Fatma's shape became gentler, not by choice, but by practice. She timed her days to the light, mornings for the small work of living, afternoons for quiet, evenings for stories told to children in voices lower than the wind. On some nights, when sleep refused to arrive, she counted the soft beats between the distant calls of watchmen and imagined the city breathing. Craftsmen, sailors, beggars, judges, all of them joined by a rhythm that did not care about rank. The thought comforted her. It made power feel smaller and human breath immeasurably large. In the 20th year after her wedding, a scholar of letters from Aleppo passed briefly through the palace and left behind a manuscript on the ethics of mercy. The text spoke in measured phrases about the difference between discipline and cruelty, about the justice that bends to protect the fragile rather than grinding them down. It was not a radical book. It was a patient one. Fatma turned its pages as if listening to a friend who never raised a voice. Some words arrive too late to change a life. They still change a day. She kept the manuscript near the chest that held the small packet of her own lines. The court spectacles continued, processions, investitures, the burnished repetition of forms that made stability visible. Those who loved appearances called it glory. Those who understood the cost called it order. Between the two words lay a silence that no anthem could fill. In that silence, a handful of women continued to map a quieter geography, drawing paths of care across rooms designed for display, a picture left within easy reach, a door that did not latch fully, A servant instructed to cough softly before entering. It was not rebellion. It was a design for survival. As the year turned that would lead to her final illness, Fatma walked once more to the pavilion where her life had been broken into before and after. The attendants kept their distance. She touched the stone of the lower stair with the tips of her fingers and felt it cold as a principle. She did not go inside. She stood long enough to let the air arrange itself around her, then turned back toward the gardens where her children's voices could be heard in quick alternation. Questions, answers, laughter, the whole bright grammar of the living. She did not look back. When the fever came, it came as many fevers do, without drama, like a guest who sits down quietly and will not be moved. The physicians did what knowledge and herbs allowed. The women kept watch in shifts and spoke to her in the present tense. On the anniversary of her wedding, heat rose and fell in waves, and between the waves there were clearings. In one, she asked for the chest. The packet of pages was placed in her hands. She did not open it. She only held it, as if to feel the weight of the words she had once wrestled out of silence. Later, when her breath thinned, she asked for the windows to remain open. Night entered with the scent of cypress and distant water. After she was gone, the palace wrote what palaces write: a fever, a date, a ceremony described in sentences that change only the names. But the women who had known her did one more thing beyond the forms. They copied out a small portion of the lines she had written, carefully, without names, and tucked them into a packet of lullabies and prayers that traveled between households whenever a girl was born. The words did not protest. They did not accuse. They named the truth without letting it devour hope. They became, over time, a kind of soft armor, not enough to stop a blade, enough to keep a heart from forgetting itself. Power continued to move in the ways power moves. Councils met, soldiers drilled, scribes recorded, and the sea kept shining. Yet somewhere in those rooms, designed to proof a story against doubt, a counter-story learned to endure, stitched into hems, folded into chests, spoken between breaths. It did not topple the palace. It made it possible for those inside to remain human within it. And in that small, persistent mercy, the measure of a different greatness flickered, not the greatness that conquers, but the kind that remembers the wounded and refuses to let a ritual have the last word. Years after Fatma's passing, the palace polished her absence into a line in a ledger and a verse in a funeral oration, then folded the page and went on, as great houses do. Yet the shape of her life did not vanish. It hovered in practices refined by habit and in pauses that entered the room whenever a royal daughter's name was spoken. The protocol that had carved her path continued, but it no longer moved unchallenged. Quietly, almost invisibly, a countercurrent grew, carried by midwives, tutors, laundresses, and scribes, women who understood that survival could be taught the way music is taught, by repetition, by listening for what cannot be said, by leaving room inside a form for breath. In Topkapı's shadows, manuals of sacred instruction remained bound in leather and stitched with the language of virtue, but the living footnotes multiplied. An elder tutor would pause before a harsh passage and say, "This line is to be recited, it need not be believed." A seamstress threading pearls into a wedding veil would slip a single knot in a place only the bride would feel, an old sign that meant, "You are seen." A bath attendant would lower the lamps by a fraction, enough to soften the edges of a room designed for dominance. These were not changes a vizier could measure. They were human margins pressed into an inhuman script. Stories traveled, as stories do, disguised as small talk. One princess in a coastal palace feigned a devotion to astronomy so convincing that her lessons occupied the hours her overseers had planned for other rehearsals. Another learned a singer's breath control, then used it to master a panic before it rose. A third, whose fear returned at the sound of boots in a corridor, arranged with her attendants to rehearse the sound each afternoon, starting distant and moving closer until the heart recognized it and did not leap as high. None of these gestures dismantled the machinery. They made living within it less like drowning. In public halls, the empire still staged its pageants. Envoys were received with the shimmer of brocade and the arithmetic of rank. Legal scholars debated nuances of inheritance while ink dried in careful strokes. Commanders mapped campaigns across parchment landscapes where rivers never changed their course. Beneath this world of lines and seals lay the other map, the one women passed hand to hand, a list of physicians who understood the difference between quiet and stupor. A spice seller who could be trusted to mix a calming draught without slipping in oblivion. A copyist willing to transcribe prayers that emphasized mercy rather than surrender. A boatman whose oars did not splash when he ferried a midwife across the strait at night. In time, the packet of anonymous lines copied from Fatma's hidden pages found its way beyond the palace. It crossed thresholds tucked among lullabies, traveled with brides in cedar chests, and slept beneath mattresses in houses that had never seen a royal procession. The lines asked nothing. They made no accusations. They named damage without making it a destiny, and they named endurance without dressing it as glory. A girl in a distant quarter read them by lamplight on the eve of a marriage arranged to settle a debt. A widow in a caravanserai mouthed them under her breath before entering a room of men to claim a fair share. A midwife, waiting outside a door, traced one sentence on her palm to steady her hand. Words do not change a structure. Sometimes they change a person enough that the structure cracks a little in the right place. There were small, recorded victories that scribes could not quite exclude. A petition granted that allowed a princess to remain in the palace until her health stabilized, a phrase broad enough to contain a reprieve, a reassignment that placed a feared overseer in a distant household, a doctrine argued with cool persistence that a marriage without the free assent of the bride risked the very order it pretended to secure. In the margins of these decisions, the handwriting of a woman could sometimes be guessed, the counsel of a grandmother, the tact of a queen mother who remembered too much, the patience of a senior tutor who had outlasted 3 chiefs of staff. Kosem's legacy lingered long after her own violent end, not only in the chronicles that counted her influence, but in the practices she left behind. The cultivation of allies across ranks, the art of making care look like custom, the refusal to let ritual swallow the person it purported to honor. Women who had watched her work adopted her tools and softened their edges, turning sharp instruments into implements of shelter. When the names changed, new sultans, new pashas, new advisors, the methods endured because they were woven into the daily fabric where edicts could not reach. Beyond the city, winds shifted, trade routes bent and stiffened. Fortresses that had seemed immovable negotiated their fate in letters before they ever saw a cannon. The empire learned the vocabulary of loss and compromise and translated it into dignity where it could. With each adjustment, the palace clung to display more tightly, polishing banisters and protocols until they shone. The brighter the surface, the more valuable the shadow work became. In that dimmer realm, women continued to rearrange the furniture of survival. An unlocked inner door here, a diversion of traffic there, a change in the order of appearance so that a frightened girl could leave a room before a certain guest entered it. The memory of the bridal pavilion remained a stone in many minds. Some women refused to step near it at all. Others went as if to inoculate themselves by proximity. A few insisted on entering together in daylight and naming each object as if to collapse its power into vocabulary: a bed, a chair, a chest, a mirror. Language cannot always unmake a fear. Naming can give the mind a handhold where otherwise there is only falling. A scribe who witnessed one such visit wrote in her private notebook, "We counted the things. We did not let them count us." In households far from court, mothers told their daughters different stories than the ones that had raised them. They kept the ballads and the proverbs, but they altered the EOI endings. The clever maiden did not simply accept a fate and find sweetness in it. She negotiated, she delayed, she gathered proof, she recruited an aunt and a neighbor, she taught a song to a child that served as a signal. These retellings did not make headlines. They thickened a culture's atmosphere with the expectation that a girl's consent mattered in a way that could not be mocked without consequence. Atmosphere is not law, but law eventually follows what everyone can breathe. There were failures, terrible ones, when signals were missed, allies proved false, or a man's anger filled a house like smoke. Grief moved through the networks then, not as gossip, but as a shared vow to tighten the mesh where it had torn. A trusted boatman grew ill and was replaced by his honest nephew. A midwife trained 2 apprentices instead of 1. A tutor wrote out copies of a legal opinion and placed them in 3 different hands. The work was granular without fanfare, the kind of work that makes grand changes possible and receives no credit when they arrive. When a later princess, bright, cautious, and trained by women who had studied the ledger of Harem, approached her arranged marriage, the palace noticed that the old rituals did not have quite the same grip. Instructions were followed, but not with the old fervor. Overseers found themselves delayed by errands that had been invisible the year before. A physician argued for gentler infusions and won. A robe fit a little looser at the wrists. A door, by accident or by design, refused to close fully. No proclamation announced reform. Practice shifted by degrees until a new normal, still unjust but less crushing, stood where the older normal had seemed eternal. The empire itself would one day recede, losing territories the way an old tree loses branches in a storm, then falling to an axe called the modern world. Topkapı would become a place where people came to look rather than to live. Guides would point and explain. Scholars would argue footnotes. Travelers would measure rooms with phone cameras and wonder how anyone had borne so much ceremony without suffocating. In those rooms, if the air is still enough, some visitors feel another current, something that does not belong to glass cases and velvet ropes. It is the residue of ordinary courage, the layered, unrecorded labor of women who kept each other alive inside a design that had not been drawn for their flourishing. If there is a moral, it is a quiet one. Not every injustice ends with a trumpet. Some end with a habit altered, a door left ajar, a word taught to a child that her grandmother did not know. Power admires spectacle. Care prefers what can pass without notice. Between them, history moves, and in that movement, the women who remembered Fatma kept faith, not in a promise delivered from above, but in a practice passed hand to hand as steady as breath. Empires teach lessons by repetition. Courts copy one another's splendors and, without admitting it, one another's harms. Beyond Istanbul, other palaces dressed control in ceremony and called it virtue. In Europe, alliances braided daughters to borders with signatures that ignored their names. In Russia, winter palaces kept rituals as strict as ice. In China, rites mapped a wife's breath to a calendar of duty and reverence. The shapes differed, the language changed, but the seam ran the same. Power asked the young to pay for the old. Yet, wherever the demand arrived, countermoves learned to travel too, small arts of shelter, discreet refusals, and the insistence that a life is not a lever. Archivists sorting bundles of brittle paper find the pattern in minor notes. An exception granted for health, a ceremony modified due to circumstance, a marriage postponed pending further counsel. Each phrase is a window cracked for air. From the outside, such lines seem like nothing. From the inside, a breath can be the difference between breaking and bending. In the Ottoman record, these footnotes multiply after Fatma's time, not reforms proclaimed from balconies, but adjustments, softer mixtures in the bridal baths, curtains placed to keep too many eyes from a single body, Tutors allowed a latitude that once would have cost them position. A ritual's power lies in its totality. Chip a corner, and the whole surface loses its glare. The mechanics of quiet resistance matured into custom through three tools: memory, mimicry, and mercy. Memory kept ledger. Who could be trusted? Which words opened doors rather than closing them? Which silences protected, and which silences endangered? Mimicry hid help within compliance, performing the form while altering its weight. The same bow held one heartbeat shorter, the same prayer inflected with hope rather than surrender. The same procession walked with an exit discreetly kept near. Mercy did what law would not. It chose the human over the perfect again and again until the choice felt ordinary. Messages moved along unexpected paths. A recipe letter sent between distant cousins smuggled a timetable for safer hours. A pattern for a child's vest carried a code. A red thread at the hem meant delay. A blue one meant proceed. A traveling singer carried a verse whose rhyme changed each season, so those who listened knew which household could offer a night's refuge. Men sometimes participated, but the architecture was unmistakably feminine, diffuse, relational, redundant, more concerned with function than credit. Networks without titles outlast councils with seals. Comparative glimpses sharpen the view. In Vienna, a princess learned the habit of pausing at thresholds until her chaperone hummed three notes, signals for clear, caution, danger, that she later taught to her daughters as a game. In Moscow, a boyar's wife convinced a confessor to preach not against disobedience, but against despair, and a sermon threaded its way into households like a kind of inoculation. In Beijing, a matron inserted an old poem into bridal lessons, one that praised the pine for bending under snow without breaking, then arranged plantings so every young bride walked past pines for a month. These were not slogans, they were seeds. Seeds ignore palaces. They answer to soil and season. Back in Istanbul, the machinery of spectacle continued, but the script softened in places where it had once cut. Overseers learned the cost of zeal when zeal produced collapse. A broken bride cannot secure an alliance. Physicians documented with clinical calm that gentler preparation yielded fewer post-ceremonial crises, and the language of efficacy, so beloved by power, became a Trojan horse for kindness. A chief white eunuch, weary of the damage, circulated a memorandum about conservation of the household's health, and doors that had always slammed began to close with care. No one called it compassion. They called it prudence, and prudence did the work compassion wanted. Scribes, those quiet anatomists of state, left the most eloquent testimony in what they did not write. Descriptions shortened. Epitaphs lost their thunder. The word glory appeared less often next to the word marriage, and more often next to the word prosperity, as if the court had remembered that power is safer when it is busy feeding people. A generation of legal minds argued that consent, while an ideal, also functioned as a stabilizer. The argument landed because it promised order, and in its wake, some girls gained time. Time to learn, time to negotiate, time to gather allies. Time is mercy's favorite instrument. The packet of lines traced to Fatma's hand continued its journey, copying itself like a vine. In one house, it lived under a basket of skeins. In another, it was memorized by a nurse who never learned to read and recited by heart to the women she tended. The lines neither cursed nor absolved. They recognized. Recognition is not a cure. It is the ground on which healing is possible. Women repeated the sentences until they fit around their own lives, and fitting drew breath more easily. Change, when it came, was piecemeal and reversible. A reform could be rescinded. A kind overseer could be replaced by a cruel one. A door left ajar could be latched again. The networks learned to plan for reversals. Redundancy was a principle, not a flaw. 2 boatmen instead of 1, 3 copies of a favorable opinion, 4 routes through a courtyard. When power shut a gate, the map already held another path. This is the mathematics of survival. Never a single point of failure, never a single savior whose fall would end the work. In the later centuries, as the empire's edges thinned and modernity pressed with treaties and telegraphs, the palace's inward gaze loosened. New schools taught girls letters without insisting that knowledge serve only obedience. Doctors trained in foreign colleges wrote discreet pamphlets on nervous collapse that blamed neither God nor womanhood, and treatments shifted from submission to care. A widow endowed a small foundation for bridal convalescence, and though the name kept its dignity, the rooms it funded were bright, airy, and no one asked why a convalescence was needed. Euphemism, once a mask for harm, became a cloak for protection. Looking across courts and centuries, a pattern emerges like a watermark. The grand narrative speaks in victories and decrees. The human narrative moves in practices and protections. Fatma's life sits where those narratives cross. She did not topple a system. Her story loosened it. It taught women to name what hurt without surrendering the capacity for quiet joy. It taught men who were willing to listen that strength breaks when it refuses to bend. And it taught future readers, standing in cool museum rooms, hearing only their own breath, that the distance between ritual and cruelty is measured not by the richness of silk, but by the presence of consent. If a single image could summarize the change, it would be this: a threshold once crossed by a terrified girl, now paused upon by a wary young woman who knows the signals, trusts the hands at her back, and does not mistake silence for safety. She steps when she chooses, not because choice has been granted from above, but because a web of care has made choice possible below. This is not triumph. It is something sturdier, a practiced mercy, reproduced until it looks like custom, durable enough to survive the weather of politics and the fatigue of time. In the end, palaces become museums and rituals become plaques. But the breath that once filled those rooms does not vanish. It lingers in thresholds and stairwells, in the places where choices were taken, and later carefully returned a little at a time. Stand in Topkapı today, and the marble still holds the nights cool. The gardens breathe. A breeze moves the leaves as if to say what the chronicles would not. The grand narrative will tell of campaigns and treaties, of years counted from founding to fall. The human narrative will remember a girl who loved the stars and the women who refused to let her story dissolve into a footnote. Fatma did not write a manifesto. She wrote a handful of lines, folded them, and kept them near. Yet those lines, copied, hidden, recited, outlived uniforms and titles, not because they were incendiary, but because they were exact. They named injury without inviting hatred to be the only answer. They named endurance without dressing it as destiny. And so they traveled, like a low flame that does not startle the eye, but warms a room enough for someone frightened to stop shaking. Change, when it respects the living, closes circles before it draws new ones. The circle that began with a scream in the year 1623 closes not with an edict, but with a practiced kindness. A door that no longer locks from the outside. A lesson rewritten so that its virtue does not require a broken will. A ceremony that asks for assent, not as decoration, but as foundation. None of this erases what was done. It does something else. It refuses to let what was done be the template forever. There is a temptation to demand a grand conclusion, a single act that writes a ledger. History rarely grants such symmetry. Instead, it offers images that carry forward. Here is one: a young woman at a window with a reed pen in her hand, copying lines she did not write, steadying her breath as she traces each curve. She is not a princess. She is a tutor or a nurse or a seamstress. She will teach a child to read. She will step between a frightened girl and a ritual's blind momentum. She will keep a key where it is needed. She will be forgotten by the books that list victories and dates. She will be remembered in the kinds of rooms where a life either shrinks or is allowed to unfold. Another image, a mother telling a story at dusk that her own mother could not tell. In her version, the heroine still walks into danger, but she is not alone. There is a signal agreed beforehand. There is an aunt who is listening. There is a neighbor who knocks at the right moment, as if by chance. The story does not deny the danger. It introduces a counterweight, the weight of care distributed across many hands. That distribution is what the old machinery could not account for. It could break one will. It struggled to break a chorus. If this tale has done its work, it leaves the mind quieter and the gaze sharper. It teaches how to read rooms, where power announces itself, and where help waits without a banner. It suggests that what rescues us is not spectacle, but practice, the steady reproduction of mercies until they feel like custom. It asks for vigilance that does not curdle into suspicion, and for compassion that does not excuse harm but refuses to mirror it. There is, finally, an invitation. Share the story with someone who trusts only the official version of events, and let that trust meet a gentler truth. Carry forward a name that would otherwise thin into rumor, and if another hidden life should be lifted into view next, choose whose. Perhaps a queen from a winter court who learned to broker peace in rooms colder than the snow outside. Perhaps an empress constrained by rites that measured her days and who still found a way to widen an hour for the women who followed. Perhaps a princess pledged to cross a border whose quiet refusal redrew more than a map. Speak the name, and the work begins again. For those who create, teach, and remember, here is the closing measure. Leave a margin in every form, a space where breath can enter, where a hand can reach through, where a mind can return to itself. Systems will always try to fill the page. Mercy is the margin that keeps the page human. If this voice has been worth the time, keep it company. Pass the tale on. Name the next hidden life to bring into the light, and let a chorus answer a silence that lasted too long.